welcome back to the Fighter Pilot Professor. I am your host, Meta. Glad you're here. Today, we have a very special guest, astronaut and author Jan Davis. We'll be talking with her about her two books. The first one, Airborne, 2 Generations in Flight, and the second one, follow-on companion to that, Airborne, The Artistic Musings of a World War II Pilot and POW. It's going to be fascinating stuff. Can't wait to jump right in. As always, you can like and follow me on Instagram and YouTube, The Fighter Pilot Professor. Find this podcast wherever you find your podcasts. And as always, remember to hit like and share so that other people can find this podcast. We'll jump right in. Welcome to the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast. I'm your host, Meta. And in the Fighter Pilot Professor podcast, every week we examine world events and your daily life through the mind of a fighter pilot. The episodes answer your questions, harnessing my experience in 25 years of flying fighter jets and my PhD in history, policy, and strategy. You can tune in wherever you find your favorite podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and on YouTube, the Fighter Pilot Professor. All right, welcome back to the Fighter Pilot Professor. I am your host, Meta, and today we have a very special guest with us, astronaut, engineer, and author, Jan Davis. Jan, welcome on the show. So glad to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Matt.
Yeah, it's really exciting. We're going to dive into all things, your books, plural, and also your time as an astronaut. But just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, as the Saturn V and the rocket that took us to the moon was being developed. So I grew up around the space program with the engines shaking the whole town and breaking windows in some cases. And I think that interest in space program came from living in Huntsville, growing up there. And of course, my interest in flying was from my father. And I went into engineering, I think, largely because of the space program and the people around me in Huntsville. So I became an engineer, worked outside of NASA for a few years. And then when NASA started hiring, I went to work for them on the Hubble Space Telescope. And that's about the same time they started selecting women astronauts, which wasn't a possibility before that. So I didn't dream of that or think I could ever do that. But once they started accepting women, I thought, wow, that would be a great job. I'm going to set that as a goal. So I worked hard to go to school, took flying lessons, scuba diving, whatever I thought might help.
Oh, wow.
Continued to work for NASA. And I was interviewed in 1984 when there were 8,000 applicants and they only interviewed 128 people. So I felt good about the odds. But I didn't make it that year. I didn't make it in 85, but I did make it in 1987. So I was selected then, flew 3 times on the space shuttle, and worked for NASA after that, after I retired as an astronaut, and then after I retired from NASA in government. I worked for a government contractor, but and then I'm still not retired. I'm still doing a little work here and there, and of course, writing books.
Right. Awesome. Yeah. Well, I mean, the good thing about writing books is you can keep doing that, right? And then it's a hobby as much as it is a profession. Well, that's good. That is really fascinating. My mother-in-law and her father, my grandfather-in-law, I guess, he worked on the Saturn V, and they lived in Huntsville as well. So, I have some connection to that community also. That's really cool. So you talked a little bit about your dad, his service, and he's kind of the one that got you interested in flying and all that stuff. And so your first book is about y'all's together journey, as it were, or parallel journeys maybe, as I guess is the best way to put it, through flying and learning about flying and his time in World War II. And then your soon-to-be published book, companion book to that book, is sort of his musings, his journal entries when he served as a POW. So we'll start at the start. We'll start with the first book. So Airborne, 2 Generations of Flight. Tell us about how that book came about, kind of what you learned along the way about writing the book, and what you learned, especially about your dad and his story.
Well, I never dreamed I would write a book about him, but when he was alive, he didn't talk about the war. He didn't talk about being a B-17 pilot or a POW. And the only time he ever talked about it with me was when he was showing me his POW journal, which is called a wartime log. It's a blank book that the YMCA and Red Cross distributed to the POWs. And he had always been a cartoonist and an artist, and so he painted paintings of his being shot down. So a series of paintings, watercolor paintings of him being shot down. He had portraits of some of his POW roommates and life as a POW in Stalag Luft 3, the long march that he had to do. And so I knew he had this journal, and I asked my sister, who I didn't really know. She was from his second marriage, but I knew she had the wartime log after he passed away. And I asked her if she would scan it and send it to me. And of course, we all get busy, and it was a few years. And lo and behold, when COVID hit, she had the time to scan it. It's 120 pages. I mean, it's a big production. So I received that on April of 2020. And when I saw the extent of the paintings and the beautiful drawings and the stories he told, I said, I have to tell this story. And as he didn't talk about it, I had to do a lot of research. I had his flight records, so I knew where he trained and I knew what kind of planes he flew, but I didn't know anything about life in the prison camp or being in England and even what bomb group he was in, that kind of thing. So I did a lot of research. And as I was learning about flying in a B-17, or in his case, he piloted the B-17, and the training he went through, the camaraderie he had, the risk that he faced, and the dedication and service and sense of duty that he had, I realized that his career and his flying and his job, his service, he stayed in the Air Force after the war, was very much like mine, my career and my flying and my training. And so I thought, wow, I should write about both of us. I was originally just going to write about him. And then there was a thread running through both our stories that I thought was interesting. And so I sort of married the two stories and made it our story. And so that's why I wrote about both of us. As far as what I learned so much about World War II air war, about the 8th Air Force, which he was in. Did research all over the country, went to England, went to Germany, where one of the prison camps was, flew in a B-17, which was a retreat.
Yeah.
I didn't really know what life was like as a POW for him. I just expected the worst. I just expected, bad things. But as it turns out, the Germans participated in the Geneva Conventions, and Stalag Luft 3 was for the officers of the airplanes. And so they were well taken care of. And the Red Cross and the YMCA, other organizations supplied, sports equipment, musical instruments, these logs and paints that he used to do his drawings and paintings. They had libraries that they taught courses to each other. I mean, they're still in prison and they're still getting really bad food, but, he wasn't being abused or, it was just a tough time because he was a POW for 21 months.
Yeah, that's not easy. It's not easy at all. Yeah.
Well, I was glad to know and glad to learn that, if you have to be in prison, that's probably one of the best camps to be in. And also, since he was shot down early in the war, before they had the fighter escorts, the B-51s, the casualty rate was like 70%.
Right.
Either MIA or killed in action, because those were just falling out of the sky. So it's probably a blessing in disguise that he was imprisoned. I know he would have rather been flying and fighting the war, but he survived the war, and I'm here.
Yeah.
So,
There's an upside, I guess, to that, right? Yeah. I'm curious, I've talked a little bit about, and I've read and watched the series Masters of the Air. I'm curious if you did the same, if you read the book or seen the series recently.
Yes. In fact, Masters of the Air was the second book that I read about the 8th Air Force. The first was A Wing and a Prayer, which was
it's a great book.
Crosby, who was a navigator in the 100th Bomb Group, and then Don Miller wrote Masters of the Air about the 100th Bomb Group, and so that was the second book I read, and I just gleaned so much information from that. And so when the opportunity came to go to England with Don Miller,
oh wow,
on the Masters of the Air tour, I jumped at the chance. So he was with us the whole time we were in England, and I was doing research for the book. He was very encouraging, very supportive. We stayed in touch during the whole process, and
awesome.
So I really appreciate that. He actually wrote the testimonial for the cover of my second book, so we're still staying in touch. But that was an incredible experience. But watching this TV series, Masters of the Air, really made the experience my father had and his crewmates come alive for me. Because, it just was so well done and so vivid. It just really made it come alive. And I think Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg did a fantastic job. I sent Tom Hanks one of my books. I had met him before in my NASA days, and he sent me a nice thank you note.
Oh, good. That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, as I was getting ready to talk with you today, I researched your dad's story as well, and you're exactly right. Like the images, the things that he talked about, and all of that stuff is portrayed. So it's interesting to see it come visually. And to your point about, it's still being in prison. That was a hard life. They portray both kind of, goods and bads in that series. So that's right. I'm curious, as you were, researching about your dad and then thinking about your own parallels to that training, what were some of the things that you really saw? You talked about service and sort of dedication to the mission as being some of those things that you saw as parallel. What were some of the other interesting, sort of maybe funnier things that you saw as parallel to that?
Well, I think the sense of camaraderie, and I know, when I was with my crews of 7, it was like a family, and we were giving each other a hard time and having fun together, but it was also a matter of survival. We're depending on each other for survival, and we each had a job to do, a different job to do, but we worked well together as a crew. And it's the same on a B-17 with the different positions that they have. They each have to do each crew member had to do his job, but at the same time, they worked together as a crew. And I think Masters of the Air did a good job of showing the camaraderie and the humor and the playing jokes on each other. But in the end, their lives depended on each other. And so that was one of the parallels that came across when I was studying what the war was like. I think the other thing is, it's not a funny story, but when I was flying on the shuttle, and I was sitting on the launch pad, I just wanted to do my job. I had been training for years for this mission, for each mission, and I didn't want to scrub. I didn't want anything to happen that would shorten the mission or whatever. I had all this science to do, the arm operations, and I just wanted to do my job. I didn't think about the fact that, I could die.
Right.
Or, and I think the guys who flew in the air war and World War II, and probably now as well, they were getting in the plane, 2 or 3 times a week, knowing they could die, but they didn't think about that.
Right. Yeah.
It was part of the mission. It was a way to win the war. They were doing it for their fellow colleagues who passed away, They watched them die every day. They lost friends, and so they wanted revenge. And so they didn't think about the bad things that could happen.
I mean, I can. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I can imagine from the perspective, I feel the same way, right? Like, I always wanted to do my job really well, and I put trust in other people and people, but people put trust in me. But from, and I always say that the air is a very unforgiving place to do business. A space is like, on the next level, quite literally, of an unforgiving place to do business. So, but I totally understand that. I want to do my job well. I'm not thinking about the risk. I'm thinking about the mission. That's a super interesting thing.
Yeah.
Your second book is really just, I hate to say really just, but it's an interesting extension of the first book, where you've taken all of his cartoons and drawings and sort of things that he put together in his wartime log, and really published those as a companion to the writing. I was reading about your dad. Like, he published a really super famous comic strip, basically weekly, for the people in Stalag Luft 3. So tell us a little bit about that part of the journey.
Yeah. So the book is not only the full wartime log, including everything uncensored, everything, but I also annotated it with explanations of what was going on, because he, of course, had the book censored. The wartime logs were censored by the Germans, and if there was something the Germans didn't like, they would tear the pages out or confiscate the book. So I added those on annotations. So there is a good bit of writing that I did to explain the wartime log. As far as the cartoon that he drew, the Penny cartoon, which he's quite well known for in the POW community. When he was imprisoned in 1943, initially he was in a compound with British Commonwealth people, and they built the South Compound and opened it in September, shortly after he arrived, of 43, and it was all Americans. And the commanding officer there, the senior American officer, wanted something that would pull that South Compound together, and he wanted this newspaper called The Circuit produced for the South Compound. And the people there who were producing The Circuit knew my father liked to draw and liked to do cartoons, and so they asked him if he would do a cartoon for the newspaper. And they said the only requirement is it has to be about a woman. So he decided he would do it about a female war correspondent whose name was Penny, and she was going to be a nice girl. She actually looks a lot like my mother looked back in the day.
Not surprisingly, I'm sure.
And turns out that the readers wanted to read about not so nice a girl. So he created a roommate for Penny named Pat, and Pat was not as nice of a girl. She had dark hair, and so anyway, he produced this cartoon to entertain and add news, something to have fun with. Each cartoon, and I have the originals, was about 14 inches long and maybe 6 inches tall. And so the newspaper was all hand done, and then this cartoon went at the bottom. And we found these cartoons all rolled up in a ball, because when he went on the long winter march, he, I guess, tucked them in a backpack or in his pants or something. But there were 96 of them.
Man, that's unbelievable.
So we have all 96 of those are reproduced in the second book, which is interesting because, looking through the cartoons, you can sort of see life in the Army Air Forces and what's on people's minds and what they wore and what they did. So it's a nice lesson in history as well as being entertaining.
And I mean, just the dedication to do that, right? I mean, it's not like they had a ton of paper and colored pencils and all the things that required to produce a newspaper, much less a comic strip along with the newspaper, right? So I mean, that's just it's both fascinating that he's willing to go through the effort to do that as a POW, but also I'm sure that there was some level of personal, like I have to keep my mind busy to survive this situation. I'm sure that also helped him personally as well. That's super fascinating.
Well, the Germans were trying to keep the prisoners busy, because if the prisoners were busy, then they wouldn't think about escaping. And so the Germans allowed the people producing the newspaper to have these big sheets of paper, to have the use of a typewriter. For him, he was able to do the cartoons in ink, and he had not been allowed to use ink before, just pencil or paint. So it's kind of interesting that the Germans allowed them to do that as long as they didn't use any of that equipment or any of those things for escape purposes. So there was a little bit of trust there in producing the paper, but it's interesting to read the papers as well. But you're right, doing the cartoon, that was a lot of work, but I know he really enjoyed it because he drew cartoons ever since he was about 10 years old.
That's funny that you say that they, if the Germans figured that they wouldn't try to escape if they were busy. But of course, Stalag 3 is famous for the quote, "The Great Escape," right? Like that's the setting for the Great Escape movie as well.
Right.
So, one of the biggest like POW escapes in history, which is pretty amazing.
While he was there,
right?
It was out of the North Compound. It was the British Commonwealth part of the prison, but it did affect how the guards treated the prisoners everywhere, and Stalag.
Sure. Right. Yeah. Well, that's super fascinating, and I totally I'm curious, how did you like doing the research as a historian, somebody that does research, for a living, I guess maybe. How did you like the research part? Because some people find it super tedious, and some people like it.
Well, I'm not a writer. I'm an engineer, and I'm not I don't even read that much other than nonfiction. But doing the research for me was about studying the airplanes, was about studying the airfields where he flew, studying how they trained. I had some information from him on how they trained. So that was fascinating to me. I wrote a lot about the airplanes and the airfields in my original manuscript. And the YB-40, which he flew. A lot of people don't know about the YB-40, which is a modified B-17. And my manuscript ended up being 200,000 words, which is double what it should.
Oh, wow.
Because I had all this cool stuff about all these airfields and planes and training, and I had to take, a good bit of that out because it was interesting to me. But and then the other thing is, I wasn't good at history either. So learning about how the air war was fought. I read a lot of books. I went out to the Air Force Academy where they have a POW library and World War II Museum, 8th Air Force Museum. And it was fascinating to me. It was just, I just didn't know that much about what he went through because he didn't talk about it. And so for me, it was learning about him, learning about what he went through. And even, after the war, when he started working in the missile and, the space program for the Air Force in its very infancy, which is why I was born at Patrick Air Force Base, which is now Space Force Base. I didn't know that either. I didn't know that he was one of the pioneers and that he worked on the Matador. And
oh, wow.
So all of that was very interesting for me. So I really enjoyed the research. I really did. I enjoyed going places. I enjoyed meeting people. There's so many people passionate about this topic and about flying in World War II, and they want to continue these stories and continue this memory of what all these people did in the war. And I continued to really enjoy studying it, reading it, meeting people.
That's awesome. I'm glad that you chose to share, both his story and your own story as a part of this through these two books. I think, besides what you learned, I think being able to share all this stuff with the world is a huge part of what you've done is amazing. So I really appreciate it. And I agree. There's tons of people. I am one of those people that likes the fact that you've done and shared this. So that's great. I appreciate it. Switching a little bit to, your story about becoming an astronaut. You were an engineer before, and you worked at NASA, and that's kind of what got you in the door. You said your first big project was working on the Hubble Space Telescope. So tell us a little bit about that, and then about you going through, once you got selected, going through becoming an astronaut.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to be hired by NASA when they were getting ready for flying the space shuttle. So I was working for an oil company, which is where the jobs were when I got out of college. When I graduated college, the space program was going downhill, and there weren't any jobs. So I was really happy to be picked up by NASA before the space shuttle started flying, and working on Hubble Space Telescope.
Right.
I mean, as an engineer, you can't ask for a more, exciting project. So I was going around the country where we were testing the structures for the Hubble, and designing the glass and how it was mounted and all of that. So I was a structures engineer on the Hubble. And it was, there weren't many women working at NASA at the time. And my supervisors just gave me great opportunities, wonderful mentoring. And they knew, once I decided to be an astronaut, they were fully supportive. I actually swam in the neutral buoyancy simulator, which was a water tank at the Marshall Space Flight Center where I worked, and met astronauts who were doing their extravehicular activity training in the water, and I was one of their support divers. So I was able to, talk with Jerry Ross and Kathy Sullivan, Pinky Nelson, and Bruce McCandless, and talk to them about, being an astronaut.
Yeah.
And, so I was very encouraged by what they had to say. And, I was going to graduate school at night and working full time. And then NASA gave me a nice full-time study fellowship. So I spent a year and a half finishing up my PhD, and that really, helped.
Yeah.
So everyone was very encouraging. And then the Challenger accident happened, which was an accident as a result of the failure of the solid rocket booster O-rings, which was a Marshall managed project. So I was put on the redesign of a different part of the solid rocket booster, and I really thought, well, they're never going to pick somebody from Marshall because of the accident. And so I just kept my head down coloring and working on the redesign for return to flight. And then I was selected the first class after the Challenger accident. I was selected in 1987 and moved to Houston. So that's the whole process of how it came about. I kept doing things I thought would help, but I also kept going to school, working at NASA, and doing the best job I could do. I thought that was probably my best ticket, was just to be a good engineer for NASA.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you kind of make it sound like it's no big deal, but I mean, you're like the 19th woman in space, right? Like I think the 15th American woman in space.
Yes.
Right. And then being able to do that after the tragedy of the accident,
right.
I mean, I think that in and of itself just speaks to how like you were willing to go through the work, as it were, to do it, and be willing to kind of sacrifice. And I mean, all of the things that you say, like I was going to school at night and I was working a full-time job, and like, and I was on all these really, really interesting projects, and yet still striving to go to space. So, I mean, besides going to space, which, don't get me wrong, is really cool, what else was motivating you to be like, I want to do this thing? Is it just like, I want to accomplish this? Or is it like, all of a sudden it became a reality and now I want to make it a goal?
I think I looked at it as combining all the things I like to do. So, it combined space, it combined engineering, it combined physical activity. It was a challenge. It was, I like people. And so it was, working with people from all over the world. Of course, working with your crew and the astronauts, but and you just learn so many different things. I mean, we had training in things I had never really studied before. Meteorology. We did a geology field trip with the guy who trained the Apollo astronauts,
Oh,
how
wow.
the rocks and, orbital mechanics and, all these different things, really sophisticated photography with a lot of different cameras. And so it was just fascinating. So that's why I set it as a goal, because I thought, well, this is like the ultimate. Because
Right.
it combines so many things that I like to do. And I really had no idea how wonderful it would be, the training, and I enjoyed the training. Yeah, flying was great, but I really enjoyed the challenge of the training too.
Yeah. It's not easy to go through that part of the training. It's for sure. It's fascinating that, like the moral of the story, in some ways is like, hey, if you surround yourself with excellent people who are doing all these excellent things, then it turns out that excellence rubs off, right? Like it makes you want to be excellent too, right? That's really cool.
So I like to inspire young people to do the same thing, to have a dream and to work hard at it. And the benefits will far outweigh the work that you're doing to get there.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that 100%. Yeah. I'm curious, you guys were back in the space flight, you're basically the first crews that go up after the Challenger disaster. So I'm curious, like, as you were working through that, were there any big issues or small issues that came up that could have become big issues as you're going through the training or as you're going through even your flights, where you're like, oh man, this feels a little worrisome. We saw what bad things can happen, or were you just like, I'm doing the mission?
Oh yeah, you're like, we're doing the mission. We didn't even talk about it.
Yeah.
And of course, after the Challenger accident, they added a lot of safety features, like the ability to bail out of a controlled gliding orbiter, and we had a lot more gear that we had to wear, and there were a lot more procedures, and so we were aware of it from that standpoint. But we all knew what the risk was. It's not like, oh, Challenger happened. Wow, didn't expect that. It's not that you expected an accident, but you knew the risk, and you knew it was a really, really harsh environment and risky environment. But that was the mission. That was what we wanted to do, what we trained to do, and didn't really think about what could happen. It wasn't talked about. So to answer your question, during the training, there was never a pucker factor, like, wow, I know that could happen.
Right.
Pretty much, when I was doing my extravehicular activity training, and you do your final suit check with your flight suit in a vacuum chamber. I mean, you're in a vacuum.
Right. Just training is dangerous.
Yeah, which is like space, and so you gain confidence in your suit, but you're like, something bad could happen here just in the vacuum chamber. Of course, there are a lot of people around that keep that from happening, but so there are risky parts of training, and from flying, high altitude flying, that's risky too. So
right.
It's part of it, and we accepted that. We didn't think about it, we didn't talk about it, but we knew it was there.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that most people, not just Americans, but most people in general, don't really appreciate. And it came to light, I feel like, in the recent struggles of getting folks off the International Space Station, of just how difficult it is to go to space, and the fact that you did it 3 times, right? Like, just the training for that is difficult and dangerous. Right. Much less the actual doing of that thing. It's unbelievable, and I salute you for all of your endeavor and grit to get to that. That's amazing.
Well, it was a team effort. It was thousands of people made it possible around the world. It was a team effort, and they don't get the visibility or the credit sometimes, but it truly is a team effort, and we should be very proud of our space program and all the people who work in it.
I agree. Well, I have just a couple of things. I want to be mindful of your time, so I don't want to monopolize it. I could have this conversation all day, frankly. I'm curious, when you were up there flying in the shuttles on your missions, was there a moment when you like looked out the window or went, during the mission where you were like, oh my goodness, I'm in space? Like, what can you tell us about like how that hit?
Yeah, it seems like a dream. It's like, did that really happen?
Right?
Because it's just so mind-boggling. I mean, when you're looking out the window of the space shuttle and watching the Earth go by, your eye can see so much more than any camera or video can show you, and it's just so much more spectacular and beautiful. And so you're just, the first time you see the Earth from space, you're like, wow.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It is beautiful. And I mean, some people, they like to just look at the Earth over land, see what they could see. I like all of it. I like looking at the cloud formations, the ocean formations. I love sunsets and sunrises. They just happen in a matter of seconds. The Earth at night. I mean, the whole thing was just beautiful. My missions were not the length of the International Space Station missions, so we didn't have a lot of time to look out the window. So I'm really envious of these people up there months at a time who can take it all in. It's just spectacular. So yeah, I usually had music playing while I was watching the Earth go by, and it was just wow.
That's awesome. Yeah. So I know that you, part of the thing that you do here in retirement, I put retirement in quotes because you're not really retired. You're, still doing things. You work with the Foundation Astro Femenina to promote STEM for young women. I'm curious if you were to give a lesson to somebody about like, how do you go and achieve a dream as huge as that? What would your advice be?
Well, I think it's important to have a goal and to work towards that goal, and realize that if you really want to make that dream come true, you're going to have to work at it. You're really going to have to do baby steps for each goal along the way, and then ultimately, hopefully achieve your dream. It's not necessarily a straight line. For me, it wasn't. But keep in mind that just do your best, whatever you do, whatever job you have, whatever school you're doing, your relationships with people, be a person who does a lot of different things, not just book learning, not, just playing, but have a balanced life, but work hard and do your best. Those are two things that, I think make a difference. And even if you don't reach your dream, your goal, at least you've improved yourself and you've learned something along the way, and you've learned how to work hard and work towards a goal.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you joining us today. And I want to add too, like, you actually achieved a goal that most people don't achieve on top of that by being an author, right? And you just picked that up like later in life, right? Like, oh, I guess I'll write a book too, right?
Yeah.
Whatever. Whatever.
If it hadn't been for COVID, it probably wouldn't have happened, because it took about 3 years of research, and I had just retired from my job, and I couldn't travel. I had all this travel plan. Couldn't work. I was really looking for something to do. So if it hadn't been for COVID, I probably wouldn't have been able to just settle down and do the research and write and focus.
Right. Well, hey, some blessings come in disguises, right?
That's right.
Well, I really appreciate you joining me here on the Fighter Pilot Professor. And as always, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much, Jan Davis. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it, Matt.